Start off with our One Detroit contributors. Say hello to Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of American Black Journal. Hey guys, the kids are back in school and there's cheers everywhere.
It's
from
the most wonderful time.
It is. They need to be back in school, and some kids started earlier. I know in my district they started before Labor Day, and a lot more school districts are doing that around the state.
We need to adopt a year-round model, and I know that, the tourism industry pushes back on that a lot, but too much knowledge falls out of these kids' heads.
I actually go back and forth about the year-round school thing. I am a little bit of a purist and believe that summer time off matters. We all had it for 3 months every year.
It's okay for them to learn how to be bored too, if they're not enriching their minds at all times. But that's just a small part of what we're talking about when we're talking about education in Michigan, specifically looking at funding right now. School districts don't know what they're going to be having to use with because the budget isn't done yet. And we're also looking at what are our achievement numbers going to be this year, because Michigan has significantly fallen behind in the last 10 years.
And we've made no substantive changes to address that. We keep tinkering around the edges and this new program and that new program. We need to radically reform the way we educate kids in Michigan. And you mentioned the Marygrove School. I mean, that's the sort of thing we need to be willing to do instead of trying to apply a broad-based model over every kid across the state. Let's allow for experimentation in the schools, individualized learning programs for children. Let's acknowledge the fact that children today are different than they were 40 years ago, so you can't simply line them up in front of a teacher and try to pound information into them. Project-based learning. There's a lot of things out there that other states and other places are trying that we are reluctant to experiment with.
But with that kind of change or that kind of innovation and experimentation, does that take different kind of funding? And should that be something that we are looking at in Michigan about maybe changing the way that we fund our schools?
So I mean, I say this a lot, and I say it a lot on the show. There are models out there that we should be emulating, and they're not ambiguous. I mean, it's not an argument about who is doing it the best. Massachusetts, Maryland, they lead the nation each year in outcomes and achievement. And if you look at the way they fund schools, if you look at the way they govern schools, if you look at the way they hold schools accountable, if you look at the way they manage innovation, those are the pathways to duplicating what they do. We don't do anything that they do in those states here in Michigan.
Would you say that it's not as political in those states, that there is a more of an above board push from the business community, or saying this is not going to change each year with the legislature, it's going to be a constant?
That's certainly the case in Tennessee and Colorado. I don't know about Massachusetts and Maryland, but we keep trying to go at this from the money end. Give us more money. I think if you've got to convince people you've got to convince people that you're going to do something with that money. And the other things Steve are talking about, we never put those together when we go. We've not done an overall education strategy in this state. Governor Snyder had the 21st Century Education Commission. How many of those initiatives were put in place?
I don't think very many.
Because we won't break down the major obstacle to reforming education in Michigan, and that's getting rid of the elected school board and Department of Education, folded it under an accountable governor who can shape a vision and bring people on board to do the things those states are doing, you're talking about.
Well, we now do have a new state superintendent who's taking on the role. We also have something big this year that a lot of parents are looking for, is that third grade retention reading law, that if kids aren't at a certain benchmark, they could be held back, and you could have thousands of kids that fall into that category, and then it's where is the catch-all for these districts to be able to then give them the help that they need to achieve that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's one of the most asinine pieces of legislation I think ever considered, let alone passed. As a practical matter, it could never work. You could never do what they are asking school districts to do, which is to hold kids back on that scale. But the other reason it makes no sense is that it ignores practice. The simplest way to make sure that kids read at level by third grade is to make sure that there's a reading specialist in every classroom in the first 3 grades, kindergarten, first and second. When you do that, and there are places in Detroit schools where you can find that they are trying that. There are places in schools all over the state where they're trying that. When you do that, you almost never come up with this issue that kids by 3rd grade are still trying to learn to read.
But that's,
we won't do that.
That's specialized help, and that does take some of the funding.
You gotta pay for it.
It does, or you can do things differently. I mean, John Engler, and I'll credit him with this idea because I think it's a good one, said the first 3 years of education should be about nothing but reading, because you can't teach anything else until the kids can read.
The curriculum already reflects that, actually.
Well, you don't have that sort of immersed reading program those first 3 years. If you did, you wouldn't have so many 3rd graders who can't read. And we know in Detroit we have this Beyond Basics program
that
has proven itself able to bring a kid to grade level reading any age, bring the kid to grade level reading by 6th grade. It's a
with
30
reading specialists. That's how they
with individualized tutor, not one for each classroom, one for each kid.
For each kid.
And it's expensive.
And that takes money. So how much money they're trying to raise?
It's $30 million, but you look at what Detroit spends on all these other programs that aren't working. Why not devote that money to this reading program that they've proven their success?
Yeah.
We don't do the things we know will work.
It's going to be actually a very interesting year when it comes to education. Stay with me. We're going to come back in just a few minutes here.